Secondly, in AD 104, the doctrine of the Trinity had not yet been defined. The author goes beyond the statement of Pliny in implying that the Christians referred to sang hymns to Jesus as God, that is, as a person of the Trinity. Although Stennett's hymns are carefully couched in biblical phrases, there are 2 or 3 references to the pre-existence of Christ. We see these in hymn 29, line 5 on page 121, and at least one reference to Christ as the eternal Son of God in hymn 36, line 7, page 131. Although pre-existence does not generally imply Trinity, in this case, coupled with the expression eternal Son of God, it does. The latter expression is an historical Calvinistic formula in opposition to the Unitarianism of Servetus. Stennett and his anonymous defender are Trinitarian in the Calvinist sense. Reliance on Pliny in defense of the Trinity is an anachronism. The author appeals to the Bible to institute congregational hymnal singing. Now, his purpose in introducing hymn singing has finally become apparent. A scriptural liturgy is not sufficient to sustain Trinitarian doctrine. He leaves the matter of the content of hymns open as long as they are decent, implying that the Bible accepts anything at all. After proving that congregational singing existed in the early church, he jumps to the conclusion that Trinitarian hymns are not only permitted but enjoined by Scripture. The argument is not even discussed, much less demonstrated. The speciousness of this casuistry ought to be apparent to honest and dishonest alike. Thirdly, there is no biblical support for a pre-dawn congregational institution. It is even possible, as early as AD 104, that Pliny is observing a Sunday morning service. That being the case, the Christians in question can hardly be examples to Sabbath observers, since they engage in practices not having biblical precedence. Now, I do further quote, and he ends here after this. Concerning the following composures, I shall only say that the subjects are well chosen and admirably adapted to the occasion, proper to excite becoming affections at the great feast of love, the Lord's Supper, instituted in commemoration of that perfect sacrifice by which alone we are delivered from everlasting destruction and entitled to eternal blessedness. The poetry is chaste and polite, the expression clear and just, in every respect becoming the noble theme. As such, I recommend it both to the public and private use of those devout Christians whose breasts are warmed by heavenly fire and whose souls are transported with a lively sense of divine love. End quote. Here, the author's praise of Stennett's hymns is undoubtedly in function of their true content and poetical worth. Some of Stennett's hymns have stood the test of centuries. The author appeals to devotion, nobility, a heavenly fire, and a lively sense of divine love. Note that all of these criteria are eminently subjective. They would all be fine if one criteria had been added, the criterion of biblicality. But Stennett has been very careful. There is a Bible quotation in almost every line of his hymns. References to unbiblical doctrines, such as the Trinity, are very few and difficult to find. The result is insidious, insinuating false doctrine in texts largely free of it. This early hymnal is but the first step in a historical development described by the prophet Amos as the temple songs being turned into howling. And if you want to have a look at that, in Amos chapter 8 verse 3, the songs of the palace will be turned to wailing in that day, or in the King James, turned into howling. It took 3.5 centuries to be complete, but finally the rock mass that has infiltrated essentially all of Christendom is the final fulfillment of Amos's words. Well, that was the end of the document, and I find it quite interesting. I love history. As we know in the past, there are those who say, no, Scripture only, can't look at history. But if we don't understand history with Scripture, we're doomed to fall into the trap of the Trinitarians, and especially those of the King James Version only movement. But history shows us where things have been infiltrated, and we ended up with false doctrine. So I hope that I made that clear.